Good to see each one this evening. I can almost see you when the lights go down. We'll be talking about the fossil record this evening, which is one of my favorite subjects. It surprises me that some Christians seem to be intimidated by the subject of the fossils. That's ought not to be the case, though sometimes they're told that this is powerful evidence for evolution. Well, let's look at the evidence tonight, and I think you'll have a different impression if you have been told that. This is the subject I really enjoy talking about, and I think you'll see why before we're finished. If we have an opportunity to debate on college campus, which we've had a number of times, this is where I want to go. We want to debate the fossil, and we do have some of those debates recorded that are available and some of them online. I think the evolutionists understand that this is critical. It's absolutely essential if they're going to prove evolution. S.M. Stanley makes that point. He's from Johns Hopkins, a very famous evolutionist. He says it's doubtful whether in the absence of fossils, the idea of evolution would represent anything more than an outrageous hypothesis. I think he's right. I think he is without it, and he continues saying the fossil record, and only the fossil record, provides direct evidence of major sequential changes in the Earth's biota. And so if you have direct evidence for evolution, this is it. This is where it's at. But how would you look at the fossil record and distinguish between creation and evolution? How would you tell which one is supported by looking at the fossils? I think it's by looking at the contrasting predictions, and this is one of the ways you compare models. That was an idea we introduced Monday evening. Here's the creation model, here's the evolution model. They predict different things. In terms of the beginning of the fossil record, the evolutionist says there should be this very simple beginning with a gradual linked increase through time. But the creationist says, no, it should be abrupt and diverse, separate, complex, right from the start. Now, since we're explaining this in terms of a flood deposit, it wouldn't be every kind of critter, but the kinds of critters that live at the bottom of the ocean that are often very complex is what we would predict would be at the beginning. As you proceed upward, the evolutionist says they should be representing allied families, branches, a continuum, a progression that you can see illustrated in the fossil record. That's what would be seen according to the evolutionist, whereas the creationist says no, stasis is the proper scientific term. That means basically no change, like status quo, distinct and separate types, rather than this branching pattern that the evolutionists would predict. Now, those are two very different pictures, John. And we should be able to look at the fossil record and tell which one is served best by the evidence. One of the things that we'll be talking about involves similarities, and this is the basis of a lot of the thinking of the evolutionist. And I believe both models predict similarities, but different types of similarities. The branching pattern, gradually branching upward like the nesting tables, would be the prediction of the evolutionist, whereas the creationist says, no, we might have a blue tile in the mosaic here and another blue tile over here, very similar, but not connected, because this is where the designer needed the blue tile, or that's where he needed the blue tile. A mosaic pattern rather than a branching pattern, both predicting similarities, but very different. Now, I can tell you, it's a mosaic pattern, it's separate and distinct, it's not gradual at the beginning, and that would maybe impress a few people, but not very many. I'm going to allow the evolutionists to describe the nature of the fossil record. We're going to be using quotes from the antagonistic witness. Now, this is a concept that is difficult to imagine, but evolutionists especially sometimes have a hard time understanding what we're doing. You're not being fair. You're quoting evolutionists to support a creationist position. Well, that's the point. You understand that testimony from a friendly witness will help some if you're in court. If you've got a friend who will say, if you're accused of something, that the accused is honest, that he has no reasonable motive to lie, that'll help you. But if you get the antagonist, the one on the other side, to admit that, then this is much heavier evidence. In court, it's called friendly witness or acknowledgments contrary to interest. And if you get somebody contrary to their own interest to acknowledge a fact, that's heavier, that weighs more. And so we're going to be using the antagonistic witness, testifying contrary to their interest. And sometimes the prosecutor will say, answer this question and then you shut up. I just want this point. But I want you to know that these men would certainly espouse evolution. I don't want to misrepresent it. They are devout believers in evolution. They are men of great faith, and I'm not trying to imply otherwise, though you might wonder when you see what they acknowledge to be true. For example, Richard Dawkins, one of the most vicious anti-creationists around from Cambridge, is talking about the beginning of the fossil record, which is the most critical part. That's where we'll focus in the first part of our session tonight. What's the nature of the fossils right at the start? As we saw, the predictions are dramatically different. Dawkins says, the antagonistic witness, we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appear. Now, wait a minute, they got there by evolution, there ought to be something ahead of them. No, first time, they're advanced. It's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Now, he has great faith that there was, but it's not there in the fossil record. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted the creationists. Well, if you see your predictions met precisely, then I guess you can say that's delightful. Plead guilty. But this is not the picture that he predicts. What he's saying is, it's the picture the evolutionist, that is, the creationist predicts. The beginning is sometimes referred to as an explosion of life, and this is a page from National Geographic as they describe the Cambrian period. That's the one at the bottom where the complex life begins in the sedimentary record. Stephen Gould, very famous evolutionist from Harvard, says the Cambrian explosion, and that term accurately depicts what they know happened, occurred at a geological moment, and we have reason to think all major anatomical designs may have made their evolutionary appearance at that time. Now, he believes it was an evolutionary appearance. But does it look like evolution when, boom, there you got all the major anatomical designs? Boom, right at the beginning, with nothing before. That's somewhat of an exaggeration. There is a little bit, but I think what is before was what was in the ground at the time the flood deposit came, and so you got some blue-green algae and some single-cell organisms. But the multicellular animals begin, boom, with an explosion, which I think is recording what you see at the bottom of the ocean at the time of the flood. Not only the phylum Chordata, the phylum is the major division in biology, and Chordata is our group, the animals with backbones. Not only this group, major division in biology that belongs at the top, according to the evolutionists, the phylum Chordata, but also all of its major divisions found where? At the top? No, at the bottom, at the lowest level. Now, if I had written that picture, I could have done a better job of that, but I didn't. This is Stephen Gould, one of the most famous evolutionists in our country. All the major divisions all the anatomical design. Right at the start, boom, and all the major divisions. And it gets worse from his standpoint. Since the so-called Cambrian explosion, no new file of animals have entered the fossil record. You got all of them right at the start, and no new ones since. In fact, you've lost some, as he goes on to say, that we see at the bottom, that we don't have. So, in terms of the beginning, the most critical part, definitive distinction between creation and evolution. Wow, they're singing our song. Maxwell Maltz, University of Texas at Austin, is a well-known paleontologist, one that we have had contact with there in Texas. He said the Cambrian explosion, it wasn't a gradual development of complexity. Now, that's exactly what the evolutionist predicts, but he says it wasn't. Instead, these things suddenly seem to burst out of a magic box. Now, you may think, wait a minute, you slipped up and got creationist in here. No. He's a devout evolutionist, and he's a very famous paleontologist, and that's the truth. Acknowledging this contrary to interest. As you see, now we could just multiply these all night long, but we need to get some maybe a little more up to date. Some would think, well, maybe 10 years ago. Here's one 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, isn't it? From the Journal of Evolutionary Biology, talking about the beginnings. Fossils from the Cambrian period can cause a real headache for evolutionary biologists. That's another way to say it does not fit our model. And as you're comparing models, this is a way to say our model's not doing too well. Instinct tells us to, and it's not instinct, it's the model. Tells us to expect simple organisms evolving over time and becoming increasingly more complex. Yes, that is what's in all the textbooks. However, during the Cambrian period, there was an apparent explosion of different major groups of animals, all appearing simultaneously in the fossil record, comparable to the morphology and variety of their living cousins when we first encounter them in the fossil record. Yeah, that's a headache, unless you're a creationist. And it's exactly what you predict. It's an explosion, and what you see is what we would expect to find, very similar to the bottom of the ocean today. So, allowing the evolutionists to describe this explosion, they say it burst out of a magic box. It's complex and sudden, right from the start, a real headache for evolutionary biologists. As Dawkins says, advanced, planted, without any evolutionary history. All the major anatomical designs, Google says, the chordata, all of its major divisions, and then no human sense. Right at the bottom. Is it hard to see which model is bearing well here, and which one is falling flat on its face? And why I like to talk about the fossil record, and even allow them to describe the nature of it. Remembering, this is not the creationist description. This is the evolutionist description of the beginning of the fossil record. Acknowledgments contrary to interest. And that is weighty evidence. But, in spite of this description of the beginning and the nature of the fossil record by the evolutionists, this is what you see in the textbook. With the chordata, the more complex, you don't get that till way up at the top, and you got these simple ones down at the bottom only. Where did that come from? It's not because of the fossils. David Rapp from the University of Chicago, writing in Science, he is one of the more famous paleontologists, curator of the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. In the years after Darwin, his advocates hoped to find predictable progressions. Now, Darwin knew and understood this was a big problem. And he predicted that the gaps, the lack of intermediate forms would be filled in. Well, he predicted that, but they have not been found. Yet the optimism has died hard and some pure fantasy has crept into the textbooks. Yes, in the textbooks, when they show these progressions, the tree like we just looked at, he's saying that's fantasy, and certainly would contradict what the others have described as the nature of it. Gould addresses those trees directly when he says, the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. It doesn't lead and branch, it's just out on the edges. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of the fossils. Now, they can come up with explanations, making any model fit with the secondary, tertiary assumptions, but this is not the fossils. We're going to talk about the fossils. They're in serious trouble. In fact, in his book, Wonderful Life, he just acknowledges that it's pretty well upside down. He says the beginning is predicted to be like this. This is the model of the evolutionists. It begins slow and gradually branches up. He says, no, it's pretty much the other way around. Actually, it begins broader than we've got it now, and it's gone downhill. He says, we have turned the traditional interpretation on its head. They have inverted the cone, which is, of course, the cone inverted as we would predict it, the opposite of their prediction. Yeah, this is in all the biology textbooks and the way it's taught in school, but it's not because of, it is in spite of the fossil evidence. We're going to stick with the fossils. We've got a very serious trouble dealing with the beginning of the fossil era. Well, where did this arrangement come from? Let's allow Dr. Batten, a textbook used typically across the country in undergraduate geology. We have arranged the groups in a traditional way, with the simplest forms first and progressively more complex groups following. It sounds a little bit like last night, if you were here. How did we get this stack? Well, we stacked it with the assumption, the circular logic, that the simple ones go on the bottom. This is what he says is how we got the tree. It's not because of the fossils, it's in spite of them. We arranged it that way with the simplest forms first, the progressively more complex groups following. The arrangement is arbitrary. Now, I want to be just as fair as I can. This is exactly what he said. But as you read further, you see that he's kind of stacking the cards against him, because he's got a reason that he continues and does describe. He says things are alike because they're related. Now, this is the basic assumption by which you build the tree. It's ignoring the fossils, which is what we're supposed to be talking about tonight. But we've got to talk about similarities in order to talk about their view of evolution, and that's where this tree comes from. They're alike because they're related, and the less they look alike, the further removed they are from the common ancestor. That's the assumption, not the fossils that build the tree. Well, let's talk about similarities a moment. Can you see any similarities here? I mean, let's be honest. Pretty dramatic. We won't get personal, but we can see some very dramatic similarities as we look at some of the apes. The question is not whether we see similarities, but why. The evolutionist doesn't ask that question. I think it's a good question to ask. He just says it's because of a common ancestor, and ball game's over, he doesn't look any further than that. Well, let's ask the question, for example, why do we see similarities when we drive through a subdivision and see houses that are cousins? Or did they have a common design? Obviously, a better explanation for what we're seeing here. That does explain similarity. But when we look in the textbooks, we're so told, look at the similarity here with the penductal form of the vertebrate hand. And with the frog, it's like the rabbit, and then the architecture is very similar. And the question, again, is not whether, but why. Common designer would explain it as well as common genetics. or at least on the surface it would. We look closer at the common genetics explanation and we see some problems, especially when we study embryology. And we see these similarities do not come from common genetics, which they should if it's common genetics that explain this. We look at the hand comes from different embryo segments with the different animals. With the frog, it comes from a different section of the embryo than the rabbit or than the lizard or than the bird. All have totally different embryology. The hand comes from a different part of the embryo, which means this is not common genetics. We see that the hand in the newt is from segments 2 through 5. In man, it's segments 13 through 15. In the lizard, it's segments 6 through 9. But this is all because of common genetics. No, that doesn't work too well, does it? On the surface, we can at least explain it as well with common designer, but then I think as we look closer, we see that we have a distinct advantage. This is not from common genetics. One of the arguments that I'll consider here, is not directly in our line of thought, but it is certainly related. When we're talking about similarities, is one that we hear very often, and that man and ape are just almost the same. There's 1% difference in our genes, according to Richard Dawkins in The Blind Watchmaker. Now, this will give you an idea of how dependable Richard Dawkins is. You know, many people think he's the leader and the god of that side. 99% similarity. But when you look in the technical literature, while that concept was popular in the early 70s, we've learned that's just that technical Arkansas word again. That's hogwash. Science in 2007 has the article entitled Relative Differences, the Myth of the 1% Difference. Studies are showing that humans and chimps are not as similar as many tend to believe. Chunks of missing DNA, extra genes, altered connections, the very structure of the chromosomes confound any quantification of humanness versus chimpness. How do you quantify 1%, 2%, 30%? It's so different that it's impossible to do that. That was 2007. We continued this time with Nature, 2010. The comparison now reveals they differ radically in sequence, in structure, in gene content. He continues in that article. The chimpanzee, and I'll just summarize some of the main points. The chimpanzee genome is 10 to 15% longer. It's not what is predicted. It doesn't sound like simpler. But how can it be just 1% difference if it's 10 to 15% longer? Can you see the problem here? 50% of the human genes were missing from the chimp. But you've got biology teachers in your schools now saying there's just 1% difference. And it's in the textbooks, and this is what Dawkins is telling us. 1/3 more gene categories, entirely different classes of genes. And so how do you quantify the difference? Well, you can't. And so this similarity is greatly overstated. We do see dramatic similarity in the living world around us, like these two fish. You see similarity here. I see some kids nodding in. If that's the case, then I caught you. Because they're not fish. They're similar, but this one is a reptile, the bottom one is a mammal, but they both look like fish, but neither one is a fish. They are similar, but they are not related. So sometimes similarity, when you look at cousins and you look at brother and sister, you can see some, that's one explanation, and that sometimes works, but then sometimes it doesn't work at all. And that's very obvious in the living world. But what you need to do, while evolutionists in the textbooks will point to similarities that serve their purpose and hope you don't look further than that, That's not good science. You need to look at all the pictures. Let's consider various characteristics of man and our closest relatives in the world around us, and it's often not the apes. It certainly does demonstrate similarity with apes. And you look at blood serum, and we're often referred to this, the chimpanzee has very similar blood serum. And this is somewhat controversial, but some will argue that if you use the right anti-serum, then you can actually utilize this as a human. I've read some say that's not possible, but anyway, that may be the case, which would indicate very similar structures there. But we look at other similarities in terms of milk chemistry, and no, the chimp milk chemistry is very different. Doesn't work. However, the donkey milk chemistry works very, very well. That's one of the closest. And some might say, well, yeah, I thought some might be kin to the donkey. But that's our closest relative in terms of milk chemistry. When we look at cholesterol, and everybody's interested in cholesterol today, lo and behold, our closest relative turns out to be the garter snake that has cholesterol just like ours, or certainly virtually the same. If you look at teeth, some of you may be concerned about losing or gaining teeth. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Who has teeth like we do? The fish. Not the ape. The ape is distinguishable readily, but I think some pretty good teeth there. This is not photoshopped. This is the sheephead. Now the ape teeth, I can see the difference here. I know some folks have some pretty sharp fangs, but they don't really look like that. Here's the sheep's head, and I know some folks that would love to have some teeth like that. And that's our closest relative if you want to look at teeth. If you look at that front tooth and take it to a dentist, I can guarantee you he will not know that this is not a human tooth. Foot structure is something we're concerned about down at Glen Road. Some say, well, maybe the ape did that, which doesn't help at all. First, the ape's foot is more like a hand than it is a foot. And it's easy to distinguish from the human, and even if it were similar, the ape is just as far removed from the dinosaurs as man, virtually. But lo and behold, the glacial bear has a foot just almost identical, or at least in some ways. You have to remove the claws, and of course, it's a mirror image. The thumbs are wrong on the outside. But if you remove the claws and you put that in a mirror and remove the flesh, there's the bones, you'd say, wow, there's my foot. And it is, it's just the same structure, not the ape. And so when you begin to look at the rest of the picture, all of the picture, which is what good science requires, then the picture gets very muddy, not the diagrams that you see in the textbooks. In terms of tear enzyme, very complex organism, a lysosome, which is all about removing waste disposal. About 50 different digestive enzymes in this very complex protein that just gobbles up little bacteria. The chicken needs that in the egg. We need that in the eye. And that's what we've got in our eye. The chicken has the same thing. Also, lo and behold, the nematode. This round worm has, again, the same very complex chemical that we have in our eyes. Wow, that's not really an evolutionary picture we're seeing, is it? And in terms of blood antigen A, our closest relative is the butterbean. Blood antigen A, just like ours. We'd be interested in brain hormones. Who has brain hormones like us? A very complex chemical, the cockroach, of all things. Notice the statement from Discover magazine, don't squash that roach, he may be your cousin. The cockroach and man share a common brain hormone. which may explain a lot of things. But when we're looking at man's relatives, what we're looking at is that mosaic pattern. Now, you can see some similarities with the apes, but also at the fish and the butterbean and the cockroach. And this is not an evolutionary picture. It's the picture of the designer who uses that blue tile where he needs it. And so, yes, it's exactly what we would predict in terms of similarities, but a mosaic pattern, not the branching pattern. So, the fossils, the critical evidence, the beginning of the fossil record, involves complex, diverse, and abrupt specimens right from the beginning, according to the antagonistic witness, and no new phyla since. The trees that you see in the textbooks are from selected similarities. They're not the whole picture. They're not from the fossils, in spite of the fossils. They're not from embryology, not from genetics, contradicted by those. And the similarities themselves that we do see when you see the whole picture show a mosaic pattern, not the branching pattern that the evolutionist predicts. And so when you look at the beginning, you look at the trees, you look at the similarities, I think in every case it's obvious, according to the leading evolutionary experts, that that evidence favors creation. Our model will serve best by the evidence. All right, my clock says exactly 31 minutes, so we're going to take a break and turn the lights on. And then if you have more questions, we'll do our best to address them at the end. We talked about the beginning, and of course the trees and the similarities that are so much different from what's predicted by the evolutionists. But in order to show evolution anywhere, you've got to see a transitional form. How do you, here are fossils. What do they say? They don't say anything. They're dead things and rocks. But how would they indicate evolution? Well, if you've got one similar to it and you see it getting more complex and more advanced and gradually developing upward, then you've got some evidence. So do we see such transition? Oh yeah, we find all kinds of them. They're told. Darwin understood, no, that's not what he saw. He says innumerable transitional forms must have existed, but why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? Why is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? I mean, this is how we got here. Every form has a lot of things leading to it, and so we should find tons of them. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this is perhaps the greatest objection which can be urged against my theory. Now, many people think he was convinced by the fossil record. No, this was his biggest problem. And geology doesn't do it. Now, he said, okay, this is the way it is, but, and it's a real objection, but my prediction is that it'll disappear as we collect more, and the problem is we haven't collected enough, and people will still make that prediction for him. That's their issue. Niles Eldridge tells us the present state of that issue in terms of the fossil record. He is the curator of the American Museum of Natural History in New York here. In his book, Myth of Human Evolution, and here's some of the things, now he was a devout evolutionist, but some of the things people believe that are not true need to be addressed by evolutionists as well as creationists. Here's a museum that has over 32 million fossil specimens. Now, he's the curator. I think this is a pretty good expert when it comes to the fossils. Somebody needs to know the nature of the fossil record. He would be the one to talk to. He, referring to Darwin, prophesied that in future generations, paleontologists would fill in these gaps by diligent search. It has become abundantly clear that the fossil record will not confirm this part of Darwin's predictions. Now, this is the way you test models. You make predictions, you see if the predictions come true. Darwin did, and fell flat on his face. It was a big problem, the biggest problem, and it's gotten bigger. Nor is the problem a miserably poor record. The record simply shows his prediction was wrong. We've got enough 32 living species. We can tell what's going on out there, and it's not what he said should be going on. Now, some would say, okay, this is now Elvin. Sure, what he's by no means a creationist, but maybe a more up-to-date quote would show something else. Eugene Kuhn is perhaps the one who's taken over. Some of the old guard have stepped back. He's the senior investigator, the Evolutionary Genomics Research Group, the National Center for Biotechnology and Information. Probably the most authoritative scientist, evolutionist today, writing in direct biology. He says there is a striking commonality between all major transitions in the evolution of life. You get something that's different. There's something that is common to all of it. In each new class of biological objects, the principal types emerge abruptly, which is not what the evolutionist predicts. And intermediate grades typically cannot be identified. This is the commonality of all major transitions. You don't see transitions, intermediate grades, transitions, same thing. Cannot be identified, typically. That's the way it works. He continues saying, this traditional concept of the tree of life, it's gone. The tree, the title of this section of his article, gone. Natural selection is the main driving force of evolution. That doesn't work anymore. That's gone. The modern synthesis, we talked about Monday night, has crumbled, apparently beyond repair. Not to mince words, the modern synthesis is gone. It doesn't fit the evidence, and the more up-to-date modern leading authorities will say it's over. Derek Hager, from several years back, was president of the British Geological Association at the time this was written, still says, it must be significant that nearly all the evolutionary stories I learned as a student have now been debunked. And he talks about some of the stories, and the ones, they're still in the textbooks, like the evolution of the horse. Anybody ever heard about that? That's been debunked, he says, president of the British Geological Association. First place, Eohippus doesn't even belong in the lineup. He says it led to the rhinos, and other than that, you've got basically little horses and big horses, which you still have today. Some of them still have the extra toes showing up. The 9-foot donkey that we excavated in near Lubbock, Texas, really messes up that chart, doesn't it? Does that? That's hard to make the picture when you include all the evidence. They don't include all the evidence. Notice the statement by George Eloy Simpson talking about this major transition according to the textbooks today. George Eloy Simpson is the one who invented this argument. This is where it came from. He's smart. The horse of North America is supposed to be one of the showcases. He says the uniform continuous transformation of Hydrocothureum and Equius, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. Now, he is a devout evolutionist, and he believes the horses evolved, but this picture in the textbook, he said this is, that technical term again, that's hogwash. It did not happen. It's a falsified picture. One of the supposed transitions referred to by Ager that has been debunked is Archaeopteryx. This is supposed to be, in the textbooks, the perfect transitional fossil. It's half bird and half lizard. It's leading to the bird, but it's mostly in between the lizard. We have beautiful fossils on them. We don't have that many. We've got, I think, 9 fossils now. 3 have been found fairly recently. Beautiful fossil feathers. They're asymmetrical. Powered flying is clearly indicated, and you look at the powered wing, and it looks just like a modern flying bird, except look out on the forward edge of the wings. Look, it's got claws, therefore it's primitive. Lots of birds have claws, like the racing, which is a perfectly modern bird which has claws on its wings. Interestingly, a number of the birds in the fossil record, like the tern, which was perfectly, precisely like the terns we have today, except some of them in the fossil record had claws, which they lost, which is evolution. Claws can be useful if you're fighting, or especially in juvenile form, when they were climbing into the nest and staying in the nest. What's the problem here? It's not a proof of anything. It lost something that it had. But the real problem with Archaeopteryx is that we find perfectly modern birds, according to their estimation of time, older and lower in the fossil record, according to their description. Here from nature, fossil remains claim to be of two crow-sized birds 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is supposed to be 150 million years. Half again is old. This is the kid that's supposed to be leading to the birds, but he's the bird leading to the so-called transition. Paleontologist Texas Tech University found the fossils said they have advanced avian features. It's kind of hard to explain the parents older, the kids older than the parents, and the results older than what led to it doesn't work. D.B. Kitts summarized, and we're summarizing this section. We did have two sections, 2 evenings, fossil record, fossil memory, trying to combine those two tonight. But he summarizes this picture of the study of transitional forms. He says the fact that discontinuities, he's writing in the journal Evolution, discontinuities are almost always and systematically present. It's not just because you had irregular sampling and you need to collect more to have it. No, they are systematically present, not continuities, discontinuities at the origin of really big categories. It is an item of genuinely historical knowledge. This is what we know. You don't see it in the textbooks. But the leading authorities writing in the journal Evolution will acknowledge this is systematic. It's something we know. Evolution, he continues, requires intermediate forms between species. Paleontology does not provide them. Now, the prediction of the moderns, we don't think you would find transitions. They say, yes, this is the way you see evolution. Who's winning the battle? Stephen Stanley of Johns Hopkins, a very famous evolutionary paleontologist, says there's not one. Most would say there's one or two, and they'd argue Archaeopteryx. He said there's not, the fossil record does not conventionally document a single transition from one form to another. Now, you may think he's a creationist. He is a very devout, written articles with Google. He thinks he has an answer for that, but I think the answer is worse. What they're devout and they believe, but it's in spite of the evidence. A.C. Stewart is talking about the plant world, it's a botanist, but it's typical of what you find throughout the animal world. Our theoretical primitive type eludes our grasp. And he talked in the context about the orchid. An orchid is an orchid. A rose is not anything like that. When you find orchids, they're orchids. What led to it? I don't know. Theoretically primitive type eludes our grasp. Our faith postulates its existence, but the type fails to materialize. Now, don't fault them for lack of faith. They got plenty. But it's not because of the evidence, it's in spite of it. They believe. As someone said regarding the faith of the evolutionist, it's the substance of fossils hoped for, the evidence of links unseen. But I don't think it's like the Christian faith. I think it's a blind faith that's in spite of the evidence, not because of it. But summarizing then the evidence for the beginning and then the beginning to end of the fossil record, the evidence without which it's just an outrageous hypothesis, delights the creationist according to the evolutionist, it embarrasses the evolutionist according to the evolutionist. It was Darwin's biggest problem, he acknowledged, and it's worse now than it was then. The links that we were taught in school have now been debunked, but we still believe it with blind faith. Now that's the picture when you get all of the evidence according to the antagonistic witness of the fossil record, and for that reason, not because of Sunday school class material, for the paleontological evidence acknowledged by the paleontologist, the fossil record favors creation. This model works better when you look at the facts. And I don't think it's arguable. I like to argue about it, and that's why I like the debate subject. Let's move quickly to the subject of fossil men, which is the same song, just a second stanza, third or fourth. It's one that is perhaps more emotional. We're very interested in our history and what happened, and you find some pretty wild claims made. And I have people, when I ask, why do you believe in this? Well, perhaps as often as any will say, well, the work the Leakeys did in the Rock Gorge, and the fossil men, Lucy and some of these fellows, are just proof that we evolved. Well, let's think about it. First question, though, before we get to apes to man, is where did the apes come from? That's kind of the beginning question. Schwartz, who's professor of biological anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh, a very devout paleoanthropologist, says we're still in the dark about the origin of most major groups of organisms, talking about the apes. And then it continues, they appear in the fossil record as Athena did from the head of Zeus, full-blown, raring to go, in contradiction to Darwin's depiction of evolution. Sounds like a creationist. He is not, he's viciously clever. But that's the truth. That's his antagonistic witness testimony. Roger Leland, a good friend of Billy Keith's, written books together, is editor of Research News of Science magazine. Now, this is a very representative scientist and very familiar, knowledgeable. And he makes, I think, a very common sense statement in his book, Bones of Contention, which is a pretty good book about the history of fossil men. The time factor, if you remove the time factors, I'd be with him on most of what he's saying. The key issue, here's the bottom line. How do you tell what's kin to what and how this thing fits together? The key issue is the ability to correctly infer a genetic relationship between two species on the basis of a similarity in appearance. You see why we spent so much time on similarities in the first session. This is the ball game. This one is similar to that one, and okay, therefore there can. But sometimes that does not indicate that. As he goes on to say, this is deceptive. This is Leland's description. Partly because similarity of structure does not necessarily imply identical genetic heritage. A shark, which is a fish, a porpoise, which is a mammal, look similar, as we pointed out. The basis, the key issue in paleoanthropology is similarity, which we know doesn't prove a point. And he acknowledges it's just a little bit deceptive. But notice the conclusion by Richard Lewin of Harvard. And to be fair to him, I'll have to acknowledge this is an interview in Harper's, and he got caught in a weak moment. I think he believes much stronger than it would seem to appear in this article. And to make it fair, you have to underscore no. We don't know anything about the ancestors of human species. Now, he thinks he knows. But no, how do you know? It's all based on similarity. You don't have tags, I'm kin to that critter when you dig them up. We don't know. All the fossils which have been dug up claim to be ancestors. We haven't the faintest idea whether they're ancestors. Well, yes, he does, but we caught him in a weak moment. He says it's up to you to draw the lines because there are no lines. Now, we forget that sometimes when we see the lines in the textbook. Let's be honest, you don't know. He acknowledges you don't really know, but this is the picture that's typically presented in the textbook. There are no lines, you have to draw the lines, and you don't know. Let's look at each of those categories, though very few paleoanthropologists think it went in that straight line way. Beginning with Australopithecus, which is pretty much the star of the show today, the ape man that was mostly, they would mostly acknowledge, discovered by Donald Hansen a number of years ago, very famous paleoanthropologist. I think you can discern most of the problem, a good bit of the problem at least. But I'll just let you listen to Dr. David Minton, about a 3-minute clip here. David Minton was professor of anatomy at American University in St. Louis. You pick up a medical dictionary, you will see all kinds of articles written by this well-known anatomist, even though he is a creationist. He writes some of the very authoritative books, but he's talking here about the hip of Lucy, which is really the key part of the evidence. Lucy stood upright, and that's supposed to prove that it was an ancestor of man. Well, we're missing our sound cord. Let's see what we got. We got to have this. Where is our audio engineer here? All I got to do is plug it in, and then it works fine. Okay, let's try again.
So you get the picture? The creatures like Lucy have the ape orientation of the iliac blades. Now, what are the evolutionists going to do about that? You're not going to believe this. Nova, have you heard Nova? There was a PBS Nova series in which Dr. Owen Lovejoy, a very distinguished, famous paleoanthropologist, was involved. And he's looking at Lucy's skeleton here, and he's lamenting the fact that the hips are all wrong. They're supposed to be human-like hips, so you can walk the way the Lopoli footprints show she walked, but they don't look like human hips, they look like ape hips. What to do about this? Watch it, you'll get a big kick out of this.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later parts.
So you see they were broken and they don't fit together properly. They did speculate in the program as to exactly who was responsible for breaking the hip, and current scientific evidence suggests perhaps a deer stepped on it. Here you can see a deer foot stepping on the bone. Isn't that a bummer? Let's see where it goes from here.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bone seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost.
This is a power saw, friends. You may want to put your goggles on.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster.
Notice he's removing whole parts, not just cutting.
He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job. But after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Look how perfect! You're going to read the newspaper through the hole.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Yeah, this is what we call science. You can teach this in the public schools, but you can't criticize it, because if you do, that would be religious. So,
interestingly, there have been 12 more discoveries of Australopithecus since this program appeared on Nova, and all 12 of them needed hip surgery. Arlene Zillman, University of California, Santa Fe, is commenting on the similarity between Lucy and the pygmy chimp, and says this is what it looks like. Zillman compares pygmy chimpanzee to Lucy, one of the oldest hominid fossils known, and finds the similarities striking. They're almost identical in body size and stature and brain, and by the way, they do stand up a good bit at a time. Not all the time, but a good bit at a time. But they're 100% apes. These commonalities, Zillman argues, indicate the pygmy chimps use their limbs much the same way Lucy did. And of course, the main feature that is supposed to distinguish this critter from the other apes is walking upright. You've got bugs that walk upright. You've got chickens that walk upright. Some lizards learn to walk upright. What does this mean about kinship to man? A very interesting thing happened in Israel, in some of the macaque monkeys reported here on the news. The workers at the zoo say that's when she started walking upright exclusively. They got sick. There was the macaque monkeys got the flu, and several of them died, and they just almost lost all of them. But this particular monkey recovered, and after the monkey had the flu, it walked upright exclusively. The zoo veterinarian says she's not sure why she's altered her behavior. The illness could have caused brain damage, and maybe that's why we walk upright. I don't know. But what does that sort of thing, or any walking upright, prove? When you look at Australopithecus, and we're summarizing and condensing here, we document from the authorities that they walked like an ape. They found, it was a pretty good while before they found the whole foot. Lucy didn't have feet preserved. But they've got a hand for a foot, and so walked like an ape. They had the brain the size of an ape, we've known that. Teeth, some said very human-like, but we have some apes that have teeth just like it. The Gladababoon has teeth just like that. A face like an ape, and arms like an ape. Some said they could scratch their ankles standing straight up. Long arms, short legs, hands like an ape, and the hands that would wrap around the branches. Legs and feet like an ape that can grasp the limbs, and toes like an ape. What do you think it was? Must have been a duck. No, I think it walks like an ape. That's what it probably was. I think there's a very good reason for that. And if you leave off the hip surgery, it becomes pretty obvious. Homo erectus is the next of the line supposed to lead to man. And this is really where the history of fossil man begins, shortly after Darwin. Up above Australopithecus, but this is the beginning of the history. And we see here some of the leading scientists at the time shortly after Darwin. There's Oakley in the center, and Black and Dawson, and some of the leading authorities at Cambridge examining the Piltdown man that was mentioned earlier. That was an intentional fraud. We don't know who the one was, probably Dawson, but we don't know. We know somebody stained and filed and made it look like an ape. This is what Darwin predicted. Somewhere there's an ape more human-like or a human more ape-like, and some famous scientist will find it. So a bunch of people went looking, and here somebody came up with it. I'll let Roger Leawood make his observation about that, and this is again the editor of Research News. He says, how is it that trained men, the greatest experts of their day, and Louis Leakey was there at Cambridge at the time, they would not let him look at it because he was a grad student and he just didn't have the stature. I mean, you had to be one of the good boys, good old boys. Anyway, how is it that trained men, the greatest experts of their day, could look at a set of modern human bones, the cranial fragments, and the cranial fragments were modern human. They look at it and they see a clear simian or ape-like signature. They saw it. And see in an ape's jaw, which is what was the jaw, the unmistakable signs of humanity. They saw it. How is it the greatest experts could see that when it wasn't there? The answers inevitably have to do with the scientists' expectations and their effects on the interpretation of the data. Or someone said, if I hadn't believed it, I wouldn't have seen it. That's pretty much what was going on. That happens a lot in science. That's why we see it. We'll have to summarize quickly Homo erectus, represented by a number of examples, like the Java man, which used to be 500,000 years old, 500,000 now is just 27,000, which pretty well takes it out of the picture. A form of Homo sapien, according to Milliford, University of Wisconsin, leading authority. The Turconoboy is in this category, though appears to be pretty modern, but it fits the date here, and so they stick it back there, though Leakey says it would be large and unnoticed in a crowd. The 1470 skull, we talked about the dating last night. Like modern humans, is the way it was described by Mary Leakey. The Latoli footprints are from this period, supposed to be made by Homo erectus. Dr. Menton mentioned those. Mary Leakey says these are people not unlike ourselves, and she's one of the experts in studying that area. And notice the dates. We're getting older here, but we're not getting more primitive. And the Kanapi man goes way back earlier, really, than Australopithecus, but we had him up here with Homo erectus, the next one on the run. Indistinguishable from modern humans, according to Charles Oxnard, who's the dean of the grad school at the University of Southern California. Again, one of the leading authorities. He used multivariate analysis to compare, for example, the arm bones with modern humans. Multivariate analysis is where you make about 1,000 different measurements of both of the bones. You put them in the computer and let the computer say it's similar or it's not, and give you a quantitative analysis of how similar. The computer says it's indistinguishable from modern humans. Before Australopithecus day. What we're looking at here are pieces of human beings, and I think what we're looking at here is, I think they're right. They look like people, and I think that's what they were, but they're supposed to be Homo erectus, according to their philosophy. Now, the next one of the lineage is Neanderthal. And if you look at what's in the textbooks, yeah, that's pretty spooky. Meet him in the back alley, it's time to run. This was a restoration done by Buell, who was contemporary with Darwin. He was making an ape-man, and his restoration has been ridiculed by modern paleoanthropologists. He's got the ankle bones on backwards. Howells, head of the anthropology department at Harvard, said by all laws of physics he should have fallen on his face with the ankle bones backwards. Well, let's just skip to the leading authorities today. Probably Triticus, Washington University is, I don't think many would disagree with the fact he probably is the leading authority on Neanderthal skeletons. You see them lined up in his office there, and is the one most often quoted. Here from Live Science. Triticus says he has not seen evidence of any kind of difference, either biological or social, between humans and Neanderthals. These were good people. You look at skulls of the Eskimo, of the American Indian, of the Chinese, of the Australian Aboriginal, of the European, you can see differences, but they're people, they're good people. This one was larger in cranial capacity than ourselves, but from what they have found in the context and what is associated with the bones, biological, social, any way you look at it, you can't find any difference here from last year. Up to date, he says, enough cheap jibes. Neanderthal may have been just as clever as modern humans. Some interesting things were reported. We want to stay current here. February 2015, is that current? Now, this is before the handouts were printed, so I think it's after the handouts were printed. They're talking about Neanderthal DNA, and there's so much overlapping here in this recent edition of Scientific American. 35 to 70% of the Neanderthal genome persists in our genes today. You could get a Neanderthal from what we've got walking around here, they would go over to say. In the same article, the switching on and switching off of genes could have distinguished moderns from Neanderthal. Why is it? Well, genes, now with the epigenome, we've learned to switch on and switch off. We talked about that earlier. That could be the explanation for the whole ballgame. They're just people that are within the range of variation that we see today. You look at some of these people, and this was Russia's representative in wrestling at the last Olympics. And you look carefully at his shape and superimpose the skull, and wow, there he is. He's walking around. And it's not that different from somebody that we're a little more familiar with. We don't want to insult Mr. James, but when you compare, boy, it fits pretty well. But lest we get accused of racism, let's notice a statement by ABC News reporting some of the work at Duke University. The image of Neanderthals may be in need of a makeover. Scientists say at least some of these extinct hominids could have had fair skin and red hair. Have you seen Neanderthals represented that way? Okay, let's do it with fair skin and red hair, and it fits. It fits pretty well. Now, at least one National Geographic decided to try to show one with red hair and fair skin. Of course, the face needs washing. She needs a coffin. But notice the statement here by BBC World News. This is the first secure evidence for their use of cosmetics. Now, the one we just looked at could use some. Just washing the face with it. It, to me, is the smoking gun that kills the argument once and for all bury this view of Neanderthals as half-wits. And that was the fact they were using cosmetics with the fair skin and the red hair. And so when we summarize what we're looking at with Neanderthal, Leakey say unquestionably Homo sapien. A ridiculous reconstruction by Buell misleads, but they, in some instances, like on Mount Carmel in Israel, where you're digging down, you actually found the moderns lower below the Neanderthal form, which is called Neanderthal earlier. They had perfectly human language. We learned from the anatomy comparisons. The brain was significantly larger. Ours averages about 1440 cc's, Neanderthal about 1600, Cro-Magnon about 1700, but Cro-Magnon is supposed to be, remember, average 6'6" in height. We don't hear much about that, except people who went to school a while back. We have same proteins that can be sequenced from the bones. As we've shown, it's our DNA from the article, 2 weeks ago. They were buried with religious ceremony. We can see the flowers and the remains in the burial ceremony. And they were musical. They played flutes with, you can see how the holes are placed. Mathematical progressions mean they have exactly the same do-re-mi scale that we got. Very primitive people. We're looking at people, and pretty good people. Some of them live in caves. We've got a lot of cave people today still live in caves, unfortunately. But that is the case, and was the case for a while then. Neanderthal was a good person. We got apes, and we got men. Where's the evolution? Modern is the next on the line that you see in the simplified textbooks. This is not a picture of evolution when you look carefully at the evidence, and we've got more time to go more into detail demonstrating that. Let me summarize this way. When you look at the proposed ancestors, you need to think about the variety that you see when you go to the city. There used to be more variety. It's gone downhill, as Google told us. But you see apes that look different from other apes. And you go to the monkey house, the ape house, and you see, wow, this is really interesting. Kids like to go look at it. They're different. There used to be more. Well, you've got to have an ancestor man somewhere, so you find one of those that went extinct, and that has to be it. And you operate on his hips, and you stand up. It's forcing the evidence, the square peg in the round hole. With humans, you see similar things. You see some people that look different from us. But as we investigate, we find they're just as reasonable, just as not, they're just really good people. And our prejudice sometimes misleads us, but even though some of them look pretty strange, we have to admit. But we've got people, and we've got apes. Now, they have desperately tried to put things in between, but that's where, as Dwayne Gish used to say, you take a little incus opus and a little hocus pocus and come up with pithecus spirits. That's what's in the middle. And when you look at all the evidence you can ask, they acknowledge it. That's documented. The fossil record of man is in favor of creation, documenting apes and men, in spite of the tremendous effort that has been put forward, like the evidence that we looked at earlier, the sudden complex beginning, the no transitional forms documented, predicted but not there. This is in favor, that is the evidence, the facts, as acknowledged by the antagonistic witness, positive evidence. We're saying, you only give negative evidence. Here's positive evidence. The fossil record for evolution. All right, let's see if some of you have some questions.